Imagine this. You come home after a long day. You slip off your shoes, wash your hands, make yourself something to eat, brush your teeth, and finally settle into bed. The kitchen looks spotless. The bathroom smells fresh. Your hands still carry the clean scent of soap. Everything feels exactly the way it should. If you're like most people, your phone is probably somewhere within arm's reach right now. Maybe it's beside you on the couch. Maybe it's on the kitchen counter. Or maybe you're even holding it as you wash this. Now, let me ask you something. What if your home wasn't as separate from the outside world as it feels? Not because you forgot to clean, not because you're careless, but because something invisible has been quietly traveling with you all day. Your shoes walked across busy sidewalks. Your phone rested on restaurant tables. Perhaps it even came with you into a public restroom. A little later, those same objects crossed your front door. Then they reached your kitchen, your bedroom, your dinner table, quietly, without asking permission, without leaving a single visible mark. And eventually, they reached you. Or maybe someone you care about even more. That is the strange thing about contamination. It rarely looks dramatic. It doesn't leave muddy footprints across the floor. It doesn't announce that it has arrived, most of the time. It simply moves. From one place to another, from one object to the next, from your hands to your food, to your face, to your pillow. Most of us were taught to notice dirt. Very few of us were ever taught to notice movement. And that small difference changes everything. Because real hygiene isn't simply about removing what you can see. It's about interrupting the invisible pathways that connect the outside world to your home. Once you learn to see those pathways, you begin noticing them everywhere. On your phone, on your shoes, on your kitchen counter, even in habits you've repeated for years without a second thought. Over the next few minutes, I'll show you 7 everyday habits that seem completely harmless but quietly allow contamination to travel much farther than most people ever realize. One of them involves something you've almost certainly touched within the last 5 minutes. And by the end of this video, I don't think you'll ever look at your home in quite the same way again. Let's begin. Before we get into the 7 habits themselves, there's something important to understand. This video isn't about living in fear of bacteria. Your home doesn't need to be perfectly sterile, and it certainly doesn't need to feel like a hospital. The goal is much simpler than that. It's about noticing the invisible boundaries that quietly shape everyday life. One of the things I've always admired about Japanese daily living is that it rarely depends on perfect self-discipline. Instead, it depends on thoughtful design. A pair of shoes stays at the entrance. A toothbrush is kept away from the toilet. A body is washed before entering the bath. Small habits, small boundaries, repeated so often that they eventually stop feeling like decisions at all. There's an interesting reason this works so well. Our brains are incredibly good at noticing what we can see. A muddy footprint on the floor catches our attention immediately. A coffee stain on the counter bothers us. But an invisible transfer from your phone to your freshly washed hands? Most of us never even think about it. Psychologists have found that our minds naturally respond more quickly to visible problems than invisible ones. In other words, if we can't see something happening, we often assume nothing is happening at all. And that's where many of our daily habits quietly fool us. Here's another interesting thought. The moment we finish washing our hands, our brain has a tendency to say, done. The task feels complete, we feel clean, but the environment around us may not have changed at all. That's why you can wash your hands perfectly. And then undo part of that effort 5 seconds later by picking up the same phone you've been carrying all day. It's not because you're careless. It's because your brain naturally focuses on completing the action, not following the journey afterward. I think that's one of the quiet lessons hidden inside Japanese daily life. Instead of asking people to remember dozens of rules every day, many Japanese homes simply make the healthier choice the easier choice. The environment does part of the thinking for you, and over time, those small boundaries become something you hardly notice anymore, because the best habits rarely depend on stronger willpower. They usually begin with a better designed environment. Before we look at the first habit, I'd like to leave you with one simple idea. If you remember nothing else from this video, I hope you'll remember this. The cleanest homes aren't always the homes that clean more. They're the homes that interrupt invisible pathways. The more I learn about Japanese daily life, the more I realize that cleanliness isn't treated as a battle against dirt. It's treated as the quiet art of creating boundaries. A boundary between outside and inside, between clean and unclean, between the places where something belongs and the places where it doesn't. At first, those boundaries may seem almost too small to matter. A pair of shoes left by the door, a toothbrush moved to a different shelf, a phone kept away from the dinner table. By themselves, none of these habits seems life-changing, but together, they quietly change the direction that everyday life flows. That's what makes them so powerful. Most people think hygiene begins with cleaning. Japanese daily life suggests something different. Good hygiene begins long before anything needs to be cleaned. It begins by preventing unnecessary movement in the first place. Once you begin seeing your home this way, something interesting happens. You stop asking, "What should I clean today?" And you start asking a different question. What crossed the boundary? That single question can quietly change the way you see every room in your home. As we go through each of the 7 habits, you'll notice they're not really separate lessons. They're simply different ways of protecting the same invisible boundary. And once you see that pattern, you'll start noticing it almost everywhere. Habit 1. Wearing your outdoor shoes inside the house. Let's start with something that happens before you've even had time to sit down. You pull into the driveway after work. Maybe you stopped at the grocery store, filled up your car with gas, walked through a parking lot, visited a doctor's office, or simply took a walk through your neighborhood. Nothing about those places feels unusual. They're just part of everyday life. But every step your shoes took collected a small piece of the world outside. Now imagine walking through your front door. Without thinking, you cross the living room. You step into the kitchen to put away the groceries. Then you head down the hallway to grab something from the bedroom. It feels completely normal. Most of us have done it thousands of times. But something else just happened. The outside world quietly came inside with you. Not because your shoes looked dirty. In fact, they may have looked perfectly clean. The problem isn't what your eyes can see. It's what your shoes have been carrying all day. Researchers have found that the bottoms of shoes can pick up microorganisms from public spaces and transfer some of them onto indoor floors after walking through a home. That doesn't mean every floor is dangerous. And it certainly doesn't mean you should panic every time someone forgets to remove their shoes. It simply reminds us of something we've been talking about all along. Movement matters. Once something crosses a boundary, it begins a new journey. That's one of the reasons I find the Japanese Genkan so fascinating. At first glance, it looks like nothing more than a small step at the entrance, but it's really much more than that. It's a quiet reminder that one world ends here and another begins. Your shoes stay below. Your home begins above. You don't have to rely on memory or self-discipline. The space itself gently guides the habit. And that's a lesson worth borrowing, even if your home doesn't have a traditional Japanese entrance. A simple shoe rack by the front door, a small bench, a pair of indoor slippers waiting nearby. Sometimes that's all it takes to create a clear boundary between outside and inside. The goal isn't perfection. The goal is making the healthier choice feel like the natural one, because over time, the habits that last are usually the ones your environment quietly supports. Microhook. And if shoes are the most obvious way the outside world enters your home, the next habit involves something that looks clean almost every single day. Habit 2. Leaving your toothbrush out in the open. Now let's step into one of the cleanest rooms in the house, or at least the room we believe is one of the cleanest. The bathroom. Most of us follow the same routine without giving it much thought. We use the toilet, flush, wash our hands, brush our teeth. Then we walk away feeling like everything is clean again. And honestly, that makes perfect sense. The room smells fresh. The sink sparkles. Nothing looks out of place. But here's the interesting part. Some of the things that matter most are the things we never see. Over the last few years, researchers have used laser imaging to study what happens immediately after a toilet is flushed. What surprised many people wasn't simply that tiny droplets could rise into the air. It was how quickly those invisible particles spread through what looked like perfectly empty space. Most of them are far too small for us to notice. The bathroom still looks exactly the same. But looking clean and remaining unchanged are not always the same thing. Some of those tiny particles may settle on nearby surfaces: the sink, the faucet, the flush handle, a towel, or an uncovered toothbrush sitting only a short distance away. Exactly how much reaches each surface depends on many things, whether the lid is closed, the design of the toilet, the room's ventilation, and how often the bathroom is cleaned. That's why I think it's more helpful to think in terms of reducing opportunity rather than eliminating risk. And that's where a simple Japanese habit makes so much sense. Instead of asking, "How do I clean this better?" the better question becomes, "Can I keep these two things farther apart?" Sometimes the smallest boundary makes the biggest difference. If your toothbrush is sitting right beside the toilet, consider moving it to a cabinet or another shelf. If that's not possible, even a simple protective cover and closing the toilet lid before flushing can reduce unnecessary exposure. None of these steps is difficult, but together, they quietly interrupt another invisible pathway before it has a chance to continue. Because the goal isn't to make your bathroom perfect. It's simply to give contamination fewer places to go. Microhook. And the next habit isn't just about keeping something clean. It's about protecting a place that's meant to help you slow down, recover, and finally leave the outside world behind. Habit 3. Washing and soaking in the same bathwater. The next habit isn't just about hygiene. In many ways, it's about something even deeper. It's about protecting the purpose of a space. For many of us, taking a bath has always meant doing everything in one place. You fill the tub, you wash your hair, you scrub your skin, you rinse. And somewhere along the way, the bath becomes both the place where you get clean and the place where you try to relax. There's nothing wrong with that. It's simply what most of us grew up with. In Japan, though, the bath tells a different story. Before anyone steps into the hot water, they wash first. Completely. Soap, shampoo, a full rinse. Only then do they enter the tub. Because the bath isn't there to clean the body. The body has already been cleaned. The bath has a different purpose. It's there to calm the mind, to slow the breath, to mark the quiet moment when one part of the day ends and another begins. Years ago, I watched a short documentary about a Japanese office worker in Tokyo. Every evening, after a crowded train ride home, he followed exactly the same routine. He left his shoes at the entrance, changed into comfortable clothes, sat on a small stool beside the bath and washed carefully. Only after rinsing everything away did he step into the hot water. What stayed with me wasn't the routine itself. It was what happened next. Nothing. No phone. No television. No scrolling. No noise. Just silence. For 10 quiet minutes, he wasn't trying to accomplish anything. He was simply allowing the day to end. I remember thinking, maybe that's what the bath was protecting all along. Not just cleanliness. Peace. That's one of the quiet lessons I admire most about Japanese homes. Every room has a purpose. The kitchen is for preparing food. The bedroom is for sleeping. The entrance separates outside from inside, and the bath is a place where the outside world is finally left behind. When every space has a clear purpose, your habits begin to change almost without effort. You don't need a traditional Japanese bathroom to borrow this idea. Take a quick shower before your bath. Leave your phone outside the room. Give yourself 10 quiet minutes with nothing to accomplish. You may discover that what restores you isn't only the warm water. It's finally giving your mind permission to arrive home. Because the next habit reminds us that even when we believe we've done everything right, our own hands may still be telling a very different story. Habit 4. Washing your hands too quickly. Now we come to the habit that may be the hardest to accept. Not because it's unpleasant, but because almost all of us believe we're already doing it correctly. Washing our hands. Most people don't skip it. In fact, many of us feel pretty good about the fact that we wash our hands several times a day. The question isn't whether you wash them. The question is whether you've quietly turned it into a routine that's just fast enough to feel finished. Public health experts often recommend about 20 seconds of washing with soap, not because 20 is a magical number, but because it gives you enough time to cover the places people most often miss. The thumbs, the fingertips, the spaces between the fingers, around the nails. Interestingly, that's exactly what children in many Japanese schools practice from a very young age, not through long lectures, not through fear, simply through repetition. They stand together at the sink, palms, backs of the hands, between the fingers, around the thumbs, across the fingertips, again and again, until one day it no longer feels like something they're trying to remember. It simply becomes the way they wash their hands. I've always found that idea surprisingly encouraging. The habits that stay with us for years usually aren't the ones that require the most motivation. They're the ones we've repeated often enough that they become almost automatic. In other words, good habits stop feeling like decisions. They become part of your environment, part of your rhythm, part of who you are. So, instead of asking yourself, how can I remember to wash my hands better? Try asking a different question. What could make the better habit easier to repeat? Sometimes the answer is as simple as keeping soap within easy reach. Sometimes it's washing your hands the same way every single time. The goal isn't perfection. The goal is consistency. Because over time, repetition quietly becomes identity. And identity is far more dependable than motivation. The next time you wash your hands, don't think about doing it longer. Think about doing it the same way, every single time. Because the next habit reminds us that sometimes what's considered polite isn't always what's considered hygienic. Habit 5. Blowing your nose loudly in public. The next habit is a little different, because this time we're talking about something that sits at the intersection of hygiene and culture. If you've ever traveled abroad, you've probably noticed how quickly ordinary habits can feel surprisingly different. Something that seems completely normal at home may feel awkward somewhere else. Blowing your nose is a perfect example. In many Western countries, quietly sniffing over and over can be distracting. Blowing your nose into a tissue often feels like the polite thing to do. You've taken care of it. Life moves on. In Japan, the expectation is often a little different. Blowing your nose loudly at the dinner table, during a meeting, or on a crowded train may make the people around you uncomfortable. Many people simply excuse themselves for a moment, take care of it privately, and then return. At first glance, it's easy to ask, so, which way is right? But I don't think that's the most interesting question. Culture is rarely about right or wrong. More often, it's about what people quietly choose to protect. In some places, the priority is solving the problem immediately. In others, it's protecting the comfort of the shared space. Neither approach makes one culture better than the other. They're simply different answers to the same human question. How do we show consideration for the people around us? Interestingly, modern research adds a little perspective here. Forcefully blowing your nose can create surprisingly high pressure inside the nasal passages. That doesn't mean blowing your nose is dangerous, and it certainly doesn't mean you should avoid doing it. It simply reminds us that gentle, thoughtful habits often serve us better than rushed ones. If you need to blow your nose, stepping away from the table, using a tissue, throwing it away promptly, and washing or sanitizing your hands afterward is a simple routine that respects both hygiene and the people sharing the space with you. To me, that's what makes this Japanese habit so interesting. It's not really about noses. It's about awareness. It's about remembering that even our smallest actions become part of someone else's day. And perhaps that's one of the quiet lessons hidden throughout Japanese daily life. Not everything needs to be louder. Sometimes consideration is almost invisible. And the next habit proves that one of the most common kitchen traditions can quietly spread far more than most people ever imagine. Habit 6. Washing raw chicken before cooking. The next habit surprises a lot of people, not because it's unusual, but because it usually comes from a place of kindness. For many families, washing raw chicken is simply how they learned to cook. Maybe your parents did it, maybe your grandparents did it, maybe someone once told you it was the safest way to prepare dinner. If that's how you grew up, it never felt careless. It felt responsible. It felt like taking good care of the people sitting around your table. And that's exactly why this habit can be so difficult to change. The intention has always been good. The problem is what happens after the water starts running. When water splashes against raw chicken, tiny droplets don't simply disappear down the drain. They scatter. Some land inside the sink, some reach the faucet. Others may settle on the countertop, nearby utensils, cutting boards, or even food waiting to be prepared. Nothing looks unusual, but another invisible pathway has quietly been created. That's why food safety experts, including the USDA and CDC, have advised for years that washing raw poultry isn't recommended. The reason isn't that the chicken becomes cleaner. It's that the water can spread contamination to places you never intended it to reach. The safest step happens later, not at the sink, but in the pan or the oven, where cooking the chicken to the proper internal temperature destroys harmful bacteria. I like that idea because it reminds us of something bigger. Sometimes the habit that feels clean isn't actually the habit that keeps things safer. If you'd like one simple kitchen habit to remember, try this. Move the chicken directly from the package to your cutting board or pan. If you want to remove excess moisture, gently pat it dry with a paper towel, throw the towel away immediately, and wash your hands before touching anything else. It takes less than a minute, but it interrupts another invisible pathway before it has a chance to spread. Because good food safety isn't about doing more. It's about keeping unnecessary movement from happening in the first place. And finally, we're about to meet the one object that quietly crosses more boundaries than almost anything else in your home. By now, you've probably noticed something. We've talked about shoes, We've talked about bathrooms, the kitchen, your hands. At first, they sounded like 7 different habits, but they were never really separate. They've all been connected by one ordinary object. Your phone. Take a second. Think about where your phone has been today. Maybe it sat on your office desk, then in your car. Maybe you placed it on a restaurant table. Perhaps you carried it into a public restroom without even thinking about it. A few minutes later, it was in your kitchen while you made lunch, then on your couch, then beside your bed, and tonight it may end up only a few inches from your face. That's an incredible journey for one object. And that's exactly why it matters. We clean ourselves. We wash our hands. We shower. We change into clean clothes. But we almost never stop to think about the things that travel with us. A while ago, I watched a documentary about a young office worker in Tokyo. Nothing dramatic happened. She finished work, rode the train home, stopped at a convenience store, answered a few messages, made dinner, called her mother, read a book before bed. It was an ordinary day, the kind of day millions of people have. But one thing caught my attention. Her phone quietly traveled through every part of it. Office, train, store, kitchen, living room, bedroom. The phone wasn't just an object anymore. It had become a bridge, and I realized that's exactly how invisible transfer happens. Not because we're careless, because we're comfortable. The objects we use every day become almost invisible to us. We stop asking where they've been. We only notice where they are. Maybe that's one of the quiet lessons behind Japanese daily life. Protecting boundaries isn't about fearing every object. It's about respecting every journey. Because every object that moves carries part of the place it just left. So the next time you pick up your phone, pause for just a second. Ask yourself one simple question. Where has this been today? That one question may change the way you think about your home. Not because your phone is the problem, but because it quietly reminds us of something much bigger. Every object has a journey, and every journey leaves a trace. That's what these 7 habits have really been teaching us all along. What these 7 habits are really about. Now that we've walked through all 7 habits, I'd like to share one final thought. Because I don't think this video was ever really about shoes, or toothbrushes, or baths, or phones. Those were just examples. The real lesson has been something much simpler. Everything we've talked about comes back to one idea. The healthiest homes don't depend on cleaning more. They depend on designing better. Think about it. A pair of shoes stays at the entrance. A toothbrush is moved to a different shelf. A phone no longer sits on the dinner table. None of these changes requires more effort. They simply change the direction things move. That's the quiet wisdom I see in so many Japanese homes. Instead of asking people to make better decisions dozens of times every day, the environment quietly makes the better decision easier. That's the difference between cleaning and design. Cleaning fixes yesterday. Good design quietly protects tomorrow. The more I learn about Japanese daily life, the less I believe their homes are cleaner because people work harder. I think they're cleaner because many small boundaries have been built into everyday life. Those boundaries guide behavior without demanding constant attention. And that's a lesson that reaches far beyond hygiene. The same idea can shape the way we eat, the way we sleep, the way we work, even the way we spend time with the people we love. Because our lives are shaped less by the decisions we make once, and more by the environments that quietly influence us every single day. Maybe that's the biggest lesson hidden inside all 7 habits. Don't ask, how can I clean more? Ask, how can I design my home so the right choice becomes the easy choice? Because a well-designed home doesn't constantly ask you to be more disciplined. It quietly helps you become the person you were trying to be all along. And perhaps that's why one simple idea has stayed with me throughout this entire journey. The best homes don't fight contamination every day. They gently prevent unnecessary journeys before they ever begin. A simple way to remember all 7 habits. If you're anything like me, you're probably not going to remember 7 different habits a month from now, and honestly, you don't need to, because all 7 habits can be reduced to 3 simple questions. Questions you can ask yourself in just a few seconds. Whenever you pick up an object, whenever you walk into a room, or whenever you bring something into your home, the first question is this: has this crossed a boundary? Think about your shoes, your phone, your grocery bags, your backpack. Where has this been before it arrived here? The second question is just as important. Does this object belong in this space? A phone may belong in your pocket, but does it belong on the dinner table? Shoes belong outside, but do they belong in the bedroom? A toothbrush belongs where it can stay clean, not simply where it's convenient. That one question changes the way you see your home. The third question is the one that quietly changes everything. Can I make the better choice easier? Not harder, easier. Could you place a shoe rack by the door? Move your toothbrush to a cabinet? Leave your phone outside the bathroom? None of those changes requires more willpower. They simply make the healthier habit easier to repeat. And that's the idea I hope stays with you. Don't try to memorize 7 different rules. Instead, remember 3 questions. Has this crossed a boundary? Does it belong here? How can I make the better choice easier? Because once those 3 questions become part of the way you see your home, the 7 habits begin taking care of themselves. That's the quiet beauty of good design. The best systems don't ask you to remember more. They help you think less while living better. A small challenge for the next 7 days. Before we finish, I'd like to leave you with one small challenge. Not 7 challenges, just one. Because real change rarely begins by trying to fix everything at once. It usually begins with one small decision that's repeated often enough to become part of who we are. So, for the next 7 days, don't try to practice all 7 habits. Choose just one. Maybe it's leaving your shoes by the door. Maybe it's moving your toothbrush to a better place. Maybe it's keeping your phone off the dinner table. The habit itself doesn't matter nearly as much as the mindset behind it. For the next week, become someone who quietly protects one invisible boundary. That's it. Don't worry about being perfect. Don't worry if you forget once or twice. Just come back to that one boundary again and again. Because every time you protect it, you're doing something much bigger than creating a cleaner home. You're teaching yourself to notice what most people never see. Over time, that changes more than a habit. It changes the way you pay attention. And once your attention changes, your daily choices begin to change with it. You may be surprised how one small boundary quietly influences dozens of other decisions without you even realizing it. That's how meaningful habits usually grow, not all at once. One quiet choice, repeated every day, until one day, it simply becomes who you are. Before you leave, I'd love to ask you something. Not which habit you're going to try, and not which one you liked the most. Instead, I'd like to invite you to try a small experiment. For the next 7 days, choose just one invisible boundary to protect. Just one. Maybe it's leaving your shoes at the door. Maybe it's keeping your phone away from the dinner table. Maybe it's moving your toothbrush to a different place. Whatever you choose, don't worry about doing everything perfectly. Just stay with that one small boundary for a week. Then come back to this video and tell us something different. Don't tell us what changed. Tell us what surprised you. Maybe you noticed how often your phone traveled from room to room. Maybe you realized one habit was much easier to change than you expected. Or maybe you discovered that protecting one small boundary quietly changed the way you looked at your entire home. I genuinely love to hear your experience. And I have a feeling you won't be the only one who learns something from it. Sometimes the most valuable ideas don't come from the person making the video. They come from the people living it. So if you decide to take the challenge, come back in 7 days. We'll be here, and I'd love to hear your story. Before we say goodbye, I'd like to leave you with one final thought. When most people think about a clean home, they think about what they can see. A shiny floor, a spotless countertop, fresh-smelling rooms. Japanese daily life quietly invites us to see something different. Not just the things that stay still, but the things that travel. Because in the end, this was never really a story about shoes, or toothbrushes, or phones. It was a story about awareness, about noticing the invisible journeys happening around us every single. And once you begin noticing those journeys, it's surprisingly hard to stop. Maybe that's why the smallest habits often create the biggest changes, not because they clean more, but because they quietly protect what matters most. So the next time you pick up an everyday object, pause for just a moment. Ask yourself one simple question. Where has this been today? Because every object carries a story, not of what it is, but of where it has traveled. And perhaps the most peaceful homes aren't the ones that spend the most time cleaning. They're the ones that gently protect the invisible boundaries that make everyday life feel calm, safe, and whole. Until next time, take good care of your home. And even more importantly, take good care of the invisible journeys happening inside it.